Now we have a whole coterie of people that go to Mars not as quote unquote astronauts, but they go as workers. So they're there working on maintenance, or they're miners, or they're doing prefabricating certain things. So there's a whole different structure of life on the base.
I would love to hear how you think this new time jump has impacted the narrative for the better. Like, what new opportunities has it afforded you?
Well, it's moved everything forward by another decade on the story and on Earth and on Mars. And I think it's always interesting to pick up first and foremost the characters, a decade later, to see how they've changed, how they've evolved, to sort of suggest things that happened in their lives in between the seasons. I always love that part of the series. And I think also it gives us an opportunity to move technology forward, to aggressively say, well, if they're really, developing all these technological advances, where would it lead them? In the previous season, we had the development of nuclear fusion. And this season, we're going out and mining asteroids and really sort of seeing what there is to be gleaned, from an expanded ability to really utilize space. So I think those are exciting things.
What's that planning process like when you're saying, all right, we're jumping forward, so technology has to jump forward, costumes have to jump forward? Where do you even start with something like that?
It's a lot of sitting around the writers' room first and sort of okay, what's the exact year we're going to be in? What are the things we would like to do? How has the world changed? And then you start looking visually, how are the costumes going to be a little different? How are the sets have evolved? You get into how are people's hair in this version of the world. So it takes a lot of time and effort just to sort of lay down the preliminary groundwork for what we're going to do each season. But it's also an ongoing conversation continuously with the production designer, with the costume designer, with the visual effects producers. You're constantly refining and changing and working out all these details on a show like this, because the joy of something like this for the audience is really immersing themselves in all the detail of the world as it changes.
What are some of the most immersive parts of this season, do you feel like, in that regard?
I think it's really interesting that we're going to follow Margot behind the Iron Curtain and go to the Soviet Union for the first time. But it's a different Soviet Union than there was historically. By this point in actual history, the Soviet Union was gone. So what is the Soviet Union in the early 2000s? And to follow Margot's journey in that world, I think is a really immersive, interesting experience.
What are you most excited to see fans react to this season? I know you can't give too much away, but
I think Margot's story in the Soviet Union is something I'm looking forward to seeing their reaction to. I'm also eager to see what they think of the asteroid and the asteroid mining and how that affects Earth politics and the sort of different class system that develops on the Martian base. Because now we have a whole coterie of people that go to Mars not as quote unquote astronauts, but they go as workers. So they're there working on maintenance, or they're miners, or they're doing, prefabricating certain things. So there's a whole different structure of life on the base. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that you don't often see. And I'm curious to see what the audience thinks of that.
And I know obviously the time in the makeup chair has changed for the actors, but I'm curious if you think the way they approach these characters, so many years later in the story differently this season.
I think each of them, takes a lot of time and thought about how their character would have changed over a decade. And now they've done it a few times now. And I know they take that challenge very seriously. And if you look closely, you'll see that they've changed. Some of them change their walk slightly as they get older. Others have different habits, different ways of sort of speaking. How they portray age is sort of individualized to each individual actor and how they take that on. But if you were to watch them all in a row, I think you would really see an interesting sort of evolution of the characters.